and the process of writing and all the rest of it. Let's go back to the very, very early days. When did you decide that you wanted to be a writer? I mean, what led you to that particular moment?
Mike, I never had that moment where I decided I wanted to be a writer. For me, I mean, I grew up in Klerksdorp, this small little gold mining town in what is today Northwest Province, where writers were myths. We didn't know writers. You read these books from these very sophisticated people. So I never had a concept of being able to be a writer. I mean, it was for smart people, it was for rich people, it was for sophisticated people. And I grew up in a blue-collar neighborhood where being a writer was just never on the cards. You either did some sort of an apprenticeship or you went to work on the mine. I think
writing is like going to work on the mines.
Yeah, true, just much harder.
Yeah.
No, so when I was at school, I grew up in a house, both my parents loved to read. And we were too poor to buy books, but my father took us to the library as many times as we wanted in a week. And the one thing about Klerksdorp, it was the Wild West, but it had a fantastic library. So I started reading and I fell in love with reading and with books at a young age. And I can remember being 8, 9, 10 years old, sitting in front of, there was a very broad little brick wall in front of the library with some pepper trees. And we sat under the pepper trees waiting for my dad to come fetch me, already reading a book. And I remember a moment where this incredible magic of what I was reading sort of took a hold of me. And I thought I would love to one day, and I didn't think of in terms of being a writer. I had this thought of one day being able to create this sort of magic for other people, to entertain to give other people the same pleasure that I'm getting from these books. I think that was the closest I came to having the desire to being a writer. And then when at high school, my English teacher started making very positive noises about my writing, my essays. And she was a wonderful woman, Mrs. Valerie de Bruin. She encouraged me to write more. She gave me an extra book and she said, whenever you want to write a story, write me one. I'll read it. I'll give you feedback. And I did. I had lots of story ideas and I wrote a lot of stories and she kept telling me they were really good. Years later, when my first translation happened, I invited her to the launch in Johannesburg, and she still had that book. And she said that after I had left, she read a lot of the stories to other children. But I think that had a very big influence on me thinking that I could write. But again, I never thought of doing it one day. Coming from what was relative blue-collar poverty, I knew I had to get a job and I had to start earning. So that was on my agenda. I became a journalist by chance and learned more about writing. And then it was only quite a long time. I mean, I kept dabbling in writing. I remember working at the University of the Free State after I spent about 4 or 5 years in journalism, and then I got a job at the University of the Free State. And I attempted a novel while working there, and it was so bad that I realized I should wait until I grew up a little bit and got mature enough to be able to create interesting characters, because the characters were one-dimensional. To make a long story short, it was only, I think, 15 years into my working career, I was in my mid-30s, when I was working in advertising, and I had to do a little video for an insurance company, and I made it a little story. I had a female secret agent as the main character, and I absolutely loved it. It was the first time since, I think, working at the university 10 years before, that I sort of fell in love with writing fiction again. I thought, well, I love this so much. Why don't I start writing short stories? I was also very poor at that time, so I thought I could earn some more money by writing short stories. And then I started writing short stories, and I started selling them to magazines, and that got the whole thing going. Okay,
2 things then that come out of this. Your English teacher was the one that got you to do the writing. Now, did that mean that you actually started writing in English?
Well, obviously I wrote Afrikaans as well, but most of what I read as a high school student was English. My mother comes from the Eastern Cape. Although she's Afrikaans, she mostly read English. So there were always English books in the house. And I very early started reading almost exclusively. At primary school, I read mostly in Afrikaans, but then sort of towards high school, I started reading exclusively in English. I discovered at the age of 14, I discovered crime fiction, Ed McBain, John D. MacDonald, those brilliant, wonderful authors. And I just kept reading in English. And I think what you read, the language and the genre that you read has a huge influence on how you write and what you write. So I felt more comfortable writing in English than I did in Afrikaans. You must also keep in mind that in those days, this was the 70s and the 80s, Afrikaans literature was not an exciting landscape. It was either, the very acceptable romances that the apartheid government did not censor, or the anti-apartheid, Andre Brink, Breitenbach kind of stuff that was not, I think, ideal for either banned or it was very high literature. So I found my pleasure in reading in English. And as a matter of fact, I kept writing my dabbling, the fiction that I was writing, I kept writing that in English until I became a journalist and really discovered Afrikaans as a language to write in, and realizing that it was actually a wonderful language to write in. So when I eventually started writing short stories, I wrote that in Afrikaans. Also because I think the Afrikaans magazines were more prone to buy short stories than I think the English ones back then.
Absolutely. I don't think there were any English ones buying anything.
Right.
The first book with the spy as the character, did that go anywhere? Do you still have it? Did it end up in the bin?
It ended up in the bin. I never pursued it again. I just realized it was really, really bad. And I did about 50, 60 pages. And I think that was my greatest talent at that time, was realizing how bad my writing was. So, and I think my mid-30s, I had grown up enough and seen enough of life to have some sort of depth to me, So, and I think that one needs that a little bit. You need to live a bit. There are exceptions. Marianne is now reading a book from an author, a young woman who wrote her first book, I think at 20 or 21, and it's sensational. I was never that smart. I was a very late bloomer. And today I'm happy that was the Oh, that's it.
Okay. So, Deon, sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Is everybody hearing that?
Yes.
Okay.
It looks like it.
Yeah, I heard that too.
It's probably some saboteur, some terrorist wanting to cut it off.
Might be.
I'm sure it is. I mean, what else could it be? Okay, let's move away from that side of things. Your working day, what does that actually look like, and when does it start?
Typically when I'm at home, or even here now in Italy, I try to get going as early as I can. Usually I start at about 5:30 to 6 o'clock. What I would do in the first stint before breakfast is to reread and rewrite what I did the day before, which saves me a lot of rewriting when the manuscript is finished eventually. But anyway, so I'll do most of my rewriting before breakfast. Then I'll have breakfast with Marianne, and then it's back and it's new pages. And it depends, Mike, on what stage the book is in. Usually in the first half of the book, I find it very hard to write past lunch. I do a lot of focused work between breakfast and lunch, usually about 1 o'clock. And then I need to think about where the story is going. So I'll take the afternoon for that and the evening. The second half of the book, I start writing more and more in the afternoons and into the evenings. And the last quarter, I often write from 5:30 in the morning until 9, 10 o'clock at night, because you know exactly where you're going. Your head is filled with what you're doing, and you really can't wait to just finish the book.
Okay, so going through these 3 stages, in the first stage, how many words are you actually putting down per day, per morning?
It depends. I use Scrivener, a fantastic writing
Yes,
app.
me too. After you put me onto it, best thing.
Okay, great. So, and Scrivener has got this little target thing that tells you if you want to finish the manuscript on that date. And usually my books are about 100 to 120,000 pages. So I will say I'd like to finish on that date. And I guess it'll be around about 100, 110,000 words. Then it tells me how much I have to write every day. So I try to use that as a ballpark target for every day. But especially the first quarter, I never get to my daily target because it's heavy going. You really have to find your way into the book. You've got to hear the voices of especially the new characters. I still do a lot of research at that stage of the book. So I'm happy if I do 5, 6, 7, 800 words per day. I'd be happy. Sometimes you do 30 and you just can't get any further. You've got to think about it first. And then the last quarter, the last third of the book, I usually do much more than I need to. So eventually I end up pretty close to that date. But I would say 600 to 800 words a day in that first quarter, I'm quite happy with, because I feel that is progress.
Yeah, okay. Do you plot? Are you somebody who sits down and meticulously plots, or does the plotting only really happen towards the end?
It's a very tough question to answer, because I don't plot on paper. I don't go sit down. As a matter of fact, I hate to do that. Isabel Dixon, my wonderful agent, asks me often to write a little synopsis of the next book. And I even hate that, because I don't want to be tied. I don't want to think it through until I have done all the research. And I want to allow the story to develop as I write. So what I will do is, when I start writing, I have an idea of more or less, well, I know where I want to start. I have a middle in mind that I know that would work, and I have an ending in mind that I think would be good. But then as I do the research and as I start writing, the middle and the end often shift. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you write towards the end that you had in mind from the word go. Sometimes it shifts. So I don't plan on paper. I don't plot on paper. I don't make long columns or boxes and lines and things. But I'm plotting all the time in my head. I think that's my way of writing is, I need to get into the book, and I need the book to fill my conscious and subconscious, so that it's there all the time. I often go to bed with a story problem, and I wake up with a solution. Or I go showering is also great, because you sort of cut off from all the external stimuli that can take your focus away. And I think if it's in there, and if your headspace is in the book, then the plotting happens almost in a natural way, where you keep thinking, Mike, you know, you and I often use the simile of writing a book is like driving a car at night. You know in which direction you're going, but all you can see is what is illuminated by the headlights, the next 2 or 3 or 4 chapters, but especially the one that you're busy with. I like it when wonderful things happen while you're writing, where you suddenly get that flash of an idea of, wow, this would be great if this happens, and if it changes the story dramatically, so be it, because it's such a nice twist in the story. So I think I plot all the time. My plotting starts from when I start visualizing the book and what could happen, and it only ends when I finish the last page.
Does this mean then that once you've started writing, it's a 24-hour-a-day experience? You're never out of the book. It's always there.
Yes, absolutely. That really works for me. and as the book progresses, more and more it is always there. And I think to Marianne is such a wonderful, patient person. She knows that, you know, the further I go into the book, the more I am absent from the reality of real life. She's very patient with me, but absolutely, it's got to grow. It's got to fill you. You got to be inside it. And for the last third of the book, you are. You live it, you breathe it, you think it, you research it. It makes for very boring conversation. I find that I'm frustrated often when we have friends over for a braai, and they can talk about all sorts of things, and the only thing I can talk about is this world that I'm living in that only I know about. But I think that's how it should be. It works for me, so I love being there.
Do you actually talk about it before it's finished?
I talk to Marianne about it a lot, but only in as much as I'm comfortable doing, because I don't want to jinx it. I don't want to tell her that this is what's going to happen. Then I feel I sort of have to. I want to keep it very open. So I will tell her every time I'm happy with something, or every time I'm really struggling with a writing problem. So she knows what I'm busy with. She knows the world that I'm in. And, you know, I will consult her on especially female dress code and that sort of thing. So she knows, but she's the only one. Obviously, Isabel Dixon, my agent, knows more or less what the story is going to be about. But Marianne is really the only person I talk to about what I'm doing.
So if you talk to her about female dress code, does this mean you don't go Googling women's underwear and
Well, sometimes I will. Sometimes if I want to know what the latest fashion is, I will Google latest female fashion. But again, I have a very bad dress sense, so I will always consult Marianne and say, look, this is the character, this is her age, this is her personality. What do you think she would wear? And Marianne is very good with that. She's also, being a painter, a very visual thinker, so she helps me a lot with that.
Okay, now, an interesting thing there. So there's research that kind of happens while you're writing, because it's kind of small research.
Yeah.
But then there must be research that you've got to go elsewhere. For argument's sake, if you've decided to set the book in France or Italy or Germany or wherever, are you John le Carré-like? Do you travel to all these places?
Yes, I do.
Okay, lots of questions there. Let's deal with the settings.
Yes, yes, I do.
When you do the settings, do you go to those places?
I go to the places if it is at all possible. Obviously, with COVID, the last book I wrote, 3/4 of it with COVID, so we were not able to travel too much. But as much as humanly possible, I want to go to the place. The great thing about actually going to the place is when you stand there and you get the smells and the sights and the atmosphere. What research does, I believe, is that it multiplies your creative choices, because writing is really, if you boil it down to its nitty-gritty basics, it's a series of creative choices, and you have to live with the consequences of every creative choice that you make. And if you don't go to a place and you imagine what it is, you have one creative choice, and that is what you have in your imagination. If you go to a place and you start looking around, I take my camera, I take a lot of photographs, I make some notes, I walk the area, I want to get a feel for it. Then suddenly you see a house or a place or an alley or a shop or a restaurant or whatever the case may be, whether it's rural or urban, then you start realizing, but hang on, if I do this or that or the other thing, that could be very interesting. Or have the girl run up here, or have the crime scene here. You know, these are interesting things. So suddenly you have more creative choices, and you can start cherry picking the best ones. So I love going to a place, not only because I love traveling and getting out there, but because it really helps me in making better creative choices in the writing process.
Okay, so the setting, the going to places comes before the writing, actually.
Well,
or do you sometimes write something and then go and check out whether you've got it right or not?
You know, because I don't plan to such a great extent, I will do a lot of research before I actually start writing, because again, that gives you a lot of ideas. If the more research, if I research, for instance, the last book that was published in Afrikaans last year was about the estate agents in Stellenbosch. So I will spend a lot of time talking to estate agents, trying to get someone of the right age, who would have had a similar experience to what I think my character would have. So I would do a lot of that beforehand. And then when you start writing and you get other ideas, it might force you to do other research too. So my research, even going to places, never stops until the book is done. So yes, I will do a lot. I will do at least half of the research before I start writing, and the other half I will do during, because you get new ideas, or you get to a specific scene that you want to do set in a certain place, and then you realize it's very boring, and then you have to go find a new one. So I will do it all through the book, all through the writing process.
Mm-hmm. The writing process itself, you've got a camera, you're taking pictures. Do you have a notebook? Do you write in longhand, or do you go straight onto a laptop?
No, well, you know, I have my phone with me, and I use the notes application for all my notes. The great thing about that is that I work with Apple, so it synchronizes with my laptop, with my big Apple that I usually write on, with my iPad, with my iPhone. So if I make notes in there, it's available immediately on all the other things that I use. So I used to carry a little notebook for my story ideas and for my research, but these days I just do it digitally.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you don't start a story in longhand, for argument's sake. You start it on your phone.
No, I will make notes on my phone, but I cannot write on my phone. I have to write. This is my keyboard. I love an old-fashioned keyboard. I don't like the modern Apple keyboards. They're too soft. I love banging a keyboard.
Journalist who grew up during the times of manual typewriting.
Exactly. And I find Marianne says she can hear a mile away if the writing is going well, because I'm really banging the keyboard. I have to have a big keyboard. I've got fairly big, fat hands and fingers, so I need the space. So no, I'll just make short notes on my phone, but the actual writing has to happen on a proper keyboard.
So that very, very first sentence, that is one that is typed. It's not something that you sit down and
it's one that is typed.
No,
it's always typed. Yeah,
it's always typed.
I have a very bad handwriting. My handwriting is, sometimes I battle to read it. So there's no use for me trying to write longhand. I was saved by typewriters and computers.
Yeah, no, me too. But I've found that a bad handwriting is often saves me from some really horrible sentences. Now, just to get to that question, which I loathe, and I'm sure all writers loathe, is the question of where do your ideas come from? But it is a very valid question, because ideas come, sometimes they are just a feeling in your chest, and that feeling suddenly over weeks, months might become an idea, and it becomes a book. Sometimes you read something and that little incident in a newspaper or magazine becomes the book. For you, how does this process actually begin? I mean, does it begin as a feeling and generate from there, from this vague thing?
Mike, yes, it does. I mean, every book, the source of every book is different. I remember with a book called Dead at Daybreak. The English translation was Dead at Daybreak.
Yeah, wonderful.
I remember sitting in the Karoo and seeing an aeroplane fly in front of the moon. And just that very vivid, evocative image got my thoughts going, and I came up with a story. The last book that I finished in Afrikaans was purely out of the news that I read during the past few years and my own experience in Stellenbosch, I firmly believe that if you feel some sort of emotion about the subject that you're writing about, the last hunt, for instance, my anger at our previous president, how he almost destroyed our country. I think that sort of feeling about a subject is very important. Heart of the Devil's Peak was a book that was born. I remember there was a period post-apartheid where suddenly the media was reporting about crimes against children under apartheid that was almost never mentioned. So as South Africans became very aware, of crime against children and the horrible things that happen. And that, I had fairly young children at the time, and that angered me so much. I started asking myself the question, what would I do if someone harmed my children and I could get my hands on him? What would I do? Would I be able to control myself? Would I be able to let the rule of law and the process of law carry on? Or would I kill someone like that? Because your children, you feel very protective about, and that feeling that came out, and that moral dilemma that came out of that thinking process became the book Devil's Peak. Sometimes you just read something that is so fascinating. The book that I've just started now is from something that I read, I think 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. A little news item 7 or 8 years ago that I thought there's a story in there, so let me set that aside. And it's been in the back of my mind now for about 8 years, and now I've got the other part of that puzzle that fits with it, and I think it's going to be an interesting story. Fever it came about, I flew back from America. I was reading a compendium of a collection of post-apocalyptic stories, and I read a wonderful short story, and I thought I could see where it was going, and that got me very excited because I thought that would be a really great story to tell. And the author did not go in that direction, and I kept thinking, but then I want to write that story that I thought it was going to be, and that eventually became Fever. So every book comes from a different source. The most important thing is, I think one must always be open to story ideas. I love talking to people. I like asking people to tell me their life stories. I love listening to people's stories. I read a lot. I read newspapers and magazines and news websites because I'm a story collector, a story idea collector all the time. 99% of the story ideas will probably never become anything, but it's that other 1% that you have to keep digging for.
Which brings me to the thing, when you're writing, for argument's sake, do you have other story ideas, or are you just focused on what you're writing?
Mike, I'm a man, I can't multitask. So no, I can only focus on what I'm busy with. I find it very hard. Sometimes I'll read something and I'll think, well, that's interesting, maybe. And I have a little folder. If I read something in a printed, and I love reading printed media, I will cut it out and put it in that folder. And when I'm finished with a book, I'll go back to the folder. But the really good ideas sort of stick in the back of your mind. So I'll see something and I think, okay, I'm taking notice, I'm putting it in the back of my mind. If it's good enough, it'll come back. And it always does. If it's a really strong idea, it always comes back. Yeah. So no, yeah.
You don't. Yeah, I have a theory that it is best just to work on one idea.
Yes.
If you've got a whole lot playing there, it's just too easy to think this one's not working, I'll go to something else.
Yeah.
Now, the force of the imagination. I mean, you've done a lot of research, but it's still imagination which drives these things. And you have to do things in the novel which you would not dream of doing in your life.
Yeah.
Killing, for argument's sake. I'm assuming that you're not a serial killer.
Not yet, Mike. Not yet.
You're planning this afterwards. You're doing all the research now.
Exactly.
Okay. That's what always worries me, as I look at all these crime novels and I think, how can the real criminals be so stupid? If they read crime novels, they'd get it right.
Right. Exactly.
Now, So when it does come to killing somebody, to killing a character, what sort of process do you go through? I mean, is this an agonizing process for you? Is it something that you can do because you're involved with the sentences and the words? Is there distance in that?
Yes, I think there's a distance. Well, early in my career, I found it much harder to do that. I think all writers have a very vivid imagination, and it's not only seeing it, but you sort of feel the fear or the anguish or the pain or whatever emotion is there. But I think you learn over time to have that distance. You know this is fiction. You know this is not real. It's like reading a book, only more intense. So I've always, to a large extent, have been able to keep that distance. But still, you know, if it's a really upsetting scene, then it upsets me. It touches you on a certain level, and sometimes I need to go for a long walk or a mountain bike ride just to get over it. It's a strange thing, you know, because I think we read so much. We know what the conventions of crime fiction are, so you know where the limits are. It's not something that I consciously think about. Crime fiction needs to be entertaining. You want to shock, but not too much. You want to capture the imagination and the attention of the reader. But I think one sort of instinctively know not to go too far.
Yeah. but there's also a certain, it's quite nice killing characters.
Absolutely, especially the really hateful ones. In the previous book, I had a real dirtbag of a character, and I loved it when he died. Unfortunately, he did not die in a bloodbath, but it was a very satisfying feeling for me.
Right. And a quick one to add to that. Are any of these ever based on people that you really want to kill?
I did that once or twice earlier in my career. There was a guy who worked at the University of the Orange Free State years ago, who was probably one of the biggest, what is a good acceptable word, but a really unpleasant person. Yeah. And I recreated him as a character, and I wanted to kill him off. And then I eventually started liking him more, and I couldn't kill him off. So I tried that once, so I've never really done it again.
All right, I just want to get to some of the questions that are starting to pop up. So
Right.
In an interview with The Guardian, you mentioned South Africa is not as sexy as Scandinavia. You have more summertime in South Africa. Do you want to elaborate on that? Or?
No, I was asked the question, why is Scandi crime more popular internationally than South African crime? And for me, it's quite obvious. I mean, for an African writer, which I am, it's always been much tougher to break through in any of the Northern Hemisphere markets, because the perception of Northern Europeans is that Africa is not a place where they will get entertainment in a book. You know, what they see on television, poverty and wars, civil wars and that sort of thing, I think they find it hard to think that they will get the same entertainment from crime fiction in South Africa than they would get from that in Stockholm or any of the Northern Hemisphere cities. So that's what I meant by South Africa not being as sexy.
Now, do you ever find that you have to write more than you need for a story to work, and how much would be edited out? This comes back to, I suppose, you're working every morning on the previous day's work. Yeah.
No, it's one of those weird and wonderful things, is that I think we are at the same time a writer and reader. And that's why my best advice to aspiring writers is to read a lot, because you have to educate the reader within. So, because that's the only person that's going to evaluate what you're writing. So you are both writer and reader at the same time, the reader assessing the pace of the story, the level of suspense, the characterization, the drama, whatever you're doing. And if that reader is well educated because you've read a lot, then you'll make much better judgment calls. So while I'm writing, that reader is sort of looking over my shoulder and saying, this is too slow, this is too much, end the chapter or end the scene. So I end up cutting very little. My rewrite is trying to find better words, a better description, that sort of thing. But I don't really cut. No, I don't cut much.
Just a thought that I had while I'm doing some research into food in your books. Are you on the board of Woolworths, or are they giving you free meals?
No, unfortunately not. There was a very angry. There was a review, I think, in the Cape Times 10 years ago or so, in which the reviewer said, "Oh, I must be getting money from one of the, I think, who's the lady who makes the wonderful spices?"
Mrs. Ball's chutney.
No.
Ina Parman.
Ina Parman. I mentioned Ina Parman's an Ina Parman product, and the reviewer said, "Oh, she must be paying me a lot of money," and it's not true. When I find products that I love, I don't mind writing about them. Also, when I have products that I hate, I don't mind writing negatively about them. I always try to think, what would this character buy from Woolies? Or not. I mean, cops probably wouldn't, because Woolies is expensive. But
it is an interesting arc in Benny's life, because this applies to him, where he stopped the burgers and started the Woolies stuff. I mean,
but it's because the love in his life, that he's lived in love. Well, his common law wife, she is a woman of means, and she would be a Woolies person, like most sort of upper middle class people in South Africa are. So that made sense to me. And I mean, Benny's not going to say no to a Woolies dish. And she's a working woman, so the Woolies food makes it easy for her.
All right. To get back to the story and the characters, do you have characters, because you have Benny Nicol and you have others? Do you fit them to a story, or does the story happen and you think, which character should I use this story with?
For me, story is always paramount. The story must come first. I've always been a little bit uncomfortable putting character first and then forcing a story on a character. Characters will be there, and you've developed them, and if you need them, they are ready for your use. But stories are not. And if you can get the story right, and I'm not saying that I always do that, but for me, that's the priority, is to try and get a story, first of all, that makes me excited and make me want to write and tell the story, because I think it's going to be really entertaining for a reader, and then going and finding characters that fit to them. Because most of my stories are crime fiction, it's sort of easy to make them Benny Nicol and Vaughan Cupido stories. But I have written a lot of other books that don't have those characters in them. So for me, story is much more important.
All right. Now, this particular story, A Woman in a Blue Cloak.
Right.
That's got an interesting beginning, because it's part of the series in Holland.
Yeah.
Now, how easy was it for you to kind of write something when you're almost, I mean, you're told you've got 30,000 words.
Right.
Right.
It was tough. It was tough on many levels. First of all, they asked me if it could be a Benny Nicol novel. So that was the one instance where I had to get something for Benny. And then the rest were my choices. I mean, I thought it would be great. The thing about that book, it was the gift book in the suspense book week in the Netherlands. The Dutch do so many wonderful things for books. They have a whole foundation for the promotion of reading and for books. So they have this children's literature week, and they have a suspense week, and they have a high literature week, and all sorts of other things. And what happens is that if you get invited to write that gift book, they print almost 500,000 of them. So it's an incredible opportunity for any author to get his work out there. What happens then is when the Dutch go to a bookshop and they spend more than, I can't remember how much it was, 10 or 15 euros on books, then they get the gift book for free. So it was a huge opportunity for me to really establish myself in the Netherlands, which is a fantastic book market. And I thought it would be cool. South Africa has this relationship with the Netherlands. If I could find some sort of a connection between the two countries. And that took me the longest to come up with an idea of what would work. So it was probably one of the more difficult stories to develop because I didn't have the freedom to do what I wanted. I was honor bound to do something, and then in a format that I've never attempted before, 27,000 odd words. I can't remember the details, which is a novella format, and it's very hard to write. Crime fiction has such a tradition and such conventions of how you explore and tell the story. So it was very hard for me to fit it all into a novella. You wanted to do everything. You wanted to showcase what you could do. You wanted to present Benny and Vaughan as full three-dimensional characters, but within that tiny space, to an audience who most of them have never read your work before. So that was a tough one. But challenging yourself, Mike, is one of the greatest things an author can do. I have a firm belief that you should try something new with every novel. My biggest fear as a writer is to stagnate, to start doing the same thing over and over again. So with every book, I try to have try a new point of view, try a type of character that I've never used before, or some way to tell the story that I've never attempted. You have to battle, you have to sweat it out, you have to fight the writing process from time to time, because that's how you really get into it and how you grow as a writer.
Yeah. Okay, I've kept you for 45 minutes. I was only going to do 30. Can you stick around for another little while?
I can stick around for another little while. The kids might come in for dinner, but they can just walk past me.
I promise you we won't do too much longer. All right, so there was one question here about who are your favorite crime authors, and apparently you're not allowed to say me. So
well, in fact, I mean, I can't think of anyone else, but you might.
I'm sure you can't. No.
There's a little list on my website, deonmeyer.com, under frequently asked questions. I have all my favorites. I still think Ed McBain is probably the most brilliant crime author of all time. I just think his work, he passed away a few years ago. I was very fortunate in at least being in the same catalog as him before he died. I think he was brilliant. I think Michael Connolly today, Ian Rankin. I mean, there are so many. Please go take a look at the FAQs on my website, because I don't want to leave anyone else out now. It would be unfair.
Indeed, it would. When you started publishing, this leads me to the next question here from a listener. Did you experience rejection to begin with? I mean, did you have a novel that was turned down, or were you lucky? Your first novel, did it get accepted straight away?
It did get accepted straight away, but it was a dismal failure. It was never translated. As a matter of fact, Tafelberg published it, and it did so badly that by the time they finally published it, they took about 2 years to publish it. I had another novel finished, which was my first translated novel, Dead Before Dying. And they actually said they're not interested because they don't think my kind of fiction, crime fiction, they said crime fiction just wouldn't sell in Afrikaans. So they weren't interested in my second one. And then I got lucky in that one of their editors had left them, and he was looking for new manuscripts, and he read my second novel and said he'll publish it with a very small publishing house, Quellerie, back then, Etty Scholes. And that was the book that Isabel Dixon read and offered to represent me internationally. So I got very lucky.
And we're talking then the mid-90s, are we?
Mid-90s, exactly, yeah.
And we now have a completely different publishing terrain, particularly Afrikaans crime fiction, which is thriving.
Yeah, I mean, I don't blame Tafelberg back then for saying that, because my first book was the first Afrikaans suspense stroke crime fiction in Afrikaans in something like 20 years. I think South Africans who read Afrikaans, people who read crime fiction, read it in English. It was an odd duck, and it sold 800 copies. They printed 1,200. It sold 800. And they sent me a very friendly letter saying, I can buy as many of the 400 that's left over as I want for R1 each. So I thought it might be the only book that I ever publish. I bought 20 so that I can show my grandchildren one day. And then...
well, in a couple of days' time, actually.
Yeah. So, yeah, exactly. So, and then, things started changing. I think Afrikaans people started accepting more and more that maybe this wasn't so bad. I got very lucky in that my third or fourth book was turned into an Afrikaans TV series that was very popular. And that to me was I was selling more books in France and in the UK and in Germany than I was in South Africa until that TV series. And I also won a French prize, which sort of, the reviews that I got in Afrikaans for my first few books was horrible. They all said this is not for intelligent people. And then when I won the French prize, they all turned around and said, "Oh, this guy is good." So I had these lucky breaks along the way.
Okay, all right. Now, this next question, we're talking about writing, but is there anything you guys want to say about publishing? Once you've written the thing and even received great feedback from readers, is the only option writing to mainstream publishers who don't even read most of the submissions they get? What advice do you have for writers out there that are facing this?
Right. I think that most South African publishers are very hungry for good manuscripts, and they will read your manuscript. If you look on their website and you follow the directions of how to submit a manuscript, they will read it. And they will definitely read the first 5 or 10 pages, so make sure that is very good. I think mainstream publishing is the only way to go. I think self-publishing is a very slippery slope. I think one should stay away. You're going to waste your money. You're going to sit with a lot of copies of your book that nobody wants. The problem with having readers, I don't know who the readers are that the person asking the question is referring to, but your mother and your wife or your husband and your friends are all going to say your writing is wonderful because they love you. Get it to a professional editor at a mainstream publishing house and let them give you a real honest assessment. When I started writing short fiction, when I started writing short stories, I sent it to the magazine story editors with a little letter saying, I don't mind if you don't accept this, but if you don't, please tell me what I did wrong so that I can keep on learning. But that would be my advice. My advice would be stick to mainstream publishing. And if they don't accept it, don't blame them. Ask yourself what is wrong and try and get feedback from them on what is wrong with a manuscript. I don't think there's any other way to go. There are people who are having success with e-publishing on Amazon, just ebooks. But you spend so much time marketing what you're doing. And you're never going to really break through and become an author who can make a living from writing if you take that route.
Okay. Now, one of the questions that has kept on coming up before we sign off is, you had a book out last year in Afrikaans, which I assume will be published this year in English. It's a Benny Grissel novel, right? So that's for everybody who wanted to know the answer to that question. It's yes. And is there another one that you're working on now?
I've just started on one now. We're very busy developing 2 TV series based on 2 of my novels and a movie based on one of my novels. So I'm spending half my time just working on the scripts at the moment. But I hope in a month or 2 I can really get going with a new Afrikaans novel that will only be out next year in Afrikaans. It's not going to be published this year.
Okay. Deon, I think it sounds like your supper's ready, and I'm dying for a glass of wine. So
Oh, enjoy it, Mike. Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure.
thank you very much for this time. It was delightful, and it was really nice hearing, we've talked so many times, but we've never actually talked about writing.
Absolutely.
It was nice to hear how it all happens for you. And I think from what I've seen in all the questions, that's about it. But everyone is very appreciative, so thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to everybody who listened. I really appreciate it.
And all the best when you're a grandpa later in the week.
Thank you, Mike. I'll let you know. Take care.
Okay.
Bye, guys. Bye, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you all.